What if every border on a map could tell a story, not just of land and power, but of fear, hope, and heartbreak? The story of Israel and its wars isn't just about nations in conflict. It's about generations caught in the crossfire, families divided by politics, and dreams shattered by violence. To truly understand this history, we have to listen not only to the battles, but to the silence that follows them, the silence of loss, of questions left unanswered, and of peace still waiting to be found. The history of the Israel attacks on different countries' wars involving Israel ** in 1948. A pivotal moment in Middle Eastern history occurred with the end of the British Mandate and the declaration of the State of Israel. Just one day after this declaration, on May 14, neighboring Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, then Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, launched a coordinated military intervention. Their goal was to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state and to support Palestinian Arabs, who had rejected the United Nations 1947 partition plan. The war that followed was the first in a series of conflicts between Israel and the Arab world. It is known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, or the War of Independence by Israelis, and the Nakba, or catastrophe, by Palestinians. At the time, the newly formed Israeli Defense Forces were relatively small and poorly equipped, but they were driven by the survival instinct and organizational unity developed during the pre-state era. The Arab armies, though larger and better equipped in some ways, lacked coordination and had differing strategic aims. As the war progressed, Israel managed not only to defend its territory but to expand it beyond the undesignated boundaries. By early 1949, ceasefire agreements had been signed with each of the invading countries. Israel held about 78% of the territory of mandatory Palestine, including parts allocated to the Arab state under the UN plan. The consequences of this war were devastating for Palestinians. Around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes, creating a long-standing refugee crisis that remains unresolved. Arab countries refused to recognize Israel, and hostility in the region deepened. The war laid the foundation for decades of conflict, shaping the modern geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East. For both sides, this war became a cornerstone of national memory. But with sharply opposing narratives and lingering pain, ** in 1956, a complex military and political conflict unfolded, known as the Suez Crisis, or the Second Arab-Israeli War. The roots of the conflict lay in Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's decision to nationalize the Suez Canal, a strategic waterway that had been controlled by British and French interests. This move was seen as a threat to Western economic and colonial power, and it alarmed both the United Kingdom and France. Simultaneously, Israel had been dealing with repeated cross-border attacks from Egyptian-controlled Gaza and faced increasing tensions over Egypt's blockade of Israeli shipping through the Straits of Trat. In a secret agreement known as the Protocol of Sevres, Britain, France, and Israel coordinated a plan. Israel would invade Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, advancing toward the Suez Canal. This would give Britain and France a pretext to intervene militarily, claiming they were protecting the canal and restoring peace. On October 29, 1956, Israeli forces launched their assault, quickly moving through Sinai and defeating Egyptian positions. Britain and France issued an ultimatum, and when Egypt refused, they began bombing Egyptian targets. International reaction to the invasion was swift and overwhelmingly negative. The United States, under President Eisenhower, strongly opposed the tripartite aggression and demanded a withdrawal. The Soviet Union also condemned the invasion and threatened retaliation. Faced with immense diplomatic pressure and economic threats, the invading powers agreed to a ceasefire. A United Nations emergency force was deployed to supervise the withdrawal and ensure peace along the Egyptian-Israeli border. Though Israel succeeded militarily and reopened access to the Straits of Tiran, it was forced to withdraw from Sinai. Politically, the crisis marked a turning point, highlighting the decline of European colonial power and the rise of Cold War dynamics. Egypt emerged with a sense of victory and strengthened nationalist pride. While the roots of further regional tension were reinforced. In June 1967, tensions in the Middle East escalated rapidly, leading to the outbreak of the Six-Day War. For weeks, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had mobilized troops in the Sinai Peninsula, demanded the withdrawal of the United Nations Emergency Force, and closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. These moves were interpreted by Israel as acts of aggression, prompting fears of an imminent multi-front attack by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. In response, Israel launched a preemptive airstrike on June 5, 1967, destroying the Egyptian Air Force on the ground and gaining immediate air superiority. With the skies under Israeli control, ground operations moved swiftly. Israeli forces invaded the Sinai Peninsula, pushing Egyptian troops back toward the Suez Canal. In the north, Israel engaged Syrian forces in the Golan Heights, a strategic plateau from which Syrian artillery had regularly targeted Israeli communities. On the eastern front, Jordan, which had entered the war in alliance with Egypt and Syria, was pushed back from East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Within 6 days, Israel had achieved a stunning military victory, capturing the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The aftermath of the war dramatically changed the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. Israel's territorial gains gave it a new strategic depth but also brought it into control of large populations of Palestinians. The capture of East Jerusalem was especially significant, both symbolically and religiously, intensifying Jewish-Muslim tensions over the city. The Arab states, humiliated by the rapid defeat, refused to recognize Israel and adopted the Khartoum Resolution of no peace, no recognition, no negotiations. Meanwhile, the United Nations passed Resolution 242 calling for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories in exchange for peace, a proposal that became the basis for future diplomatic efforts. In October 1973, a major war broke out in the Middle East, known as the Yom Kippur War, or the October War. It began on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, when Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated surprise attack against Israel. Their goal was to reclaim territories lost in the 1967 Six-Day War, specifically the Sinai Peninsula for Egypt and the Golan Heights for Syria. The attack took Israel by surprise, as many soldiers were observing the religious holiday, and early gains by Arab forces shook Israeli confidence. Egyptian troops crossed the Suez Canal under heavy artillery cover and established strong bridges on the eastern bank, defeating initial Israeli resistance. Simultaneously, Syrian forces stormed the Golan Heights and advanced significantly into Israeli-held territory. The Israeli military mobilized rapidly, and after several days of intense fighting, it began pushing back the invading forces. In the Sinai, Israel launched a bold counterattack led by General Ariel Sharon, who crossed the Suez Canal into Egypt, encircling the Egyptian Third Army. In the north, Israeli forces drove Syrian troops back beyond the pre-war lines, coming within striking distance of Damascus. The superpowers were deeply involved behind the scenes. The United States airlifted military supplies to Israel, while the Soviet Union resupplied Egypt and Syria. The conflict escalated tensions globally and brought the world dangerously close to a direct confrontation between the US and the USA. A United Nations brokered ceasefire eventually brought the fighting to an end. Though Israel emerged with military advantages, the war shattered its image of invincibility and led to a period of national reflection. For Egypt, the war restored a sense of pride and paved the way for future peace negotiations, including the eventual Camp David Accords with Israel in 1978. In 1982, Israel launched a large-scale military operation into Lebanon, known as the First Lebanon War. The stated goal was to drive out the Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO), which had established a strong presence in southern Lebanon and had been launching attacks into northern Israel. Tensions had been rising for years due to the ongoing civil war in Lebanon and the increasing power of non-state actors like the PLO within the country. After an assassination attempt on the Israeli ambassador in London, which was blamed on a Palestinian faction, Israel began its invasion under the name Operation Peace for Galilee. Israeli forces moved quickly, advancing as far as Beirut with the support of Christian militias allied against the PLO. The military campaign included intense shelling and airstrikes, leading to heavy civilian casualties and widespread destruction, especially in densely populated urban areas. Israeli troops laid siege to West Beirut, where the PLO had established its headquarters. Under international pressure, a ceasefire was eventually negotiated, and the PLO leadership was evacuated to Tunisia. However, Israel did not fully withdraw from Lebanon, remaining in the south to create a security buffer zone. One of the most controversial episodes of the war was the massacre in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, where Christian Phalangist militias under the watch of Israeli forces killed hundreds of Palestinian civilians. This led to international outrage and massive protests within Israel itself. The war became deeply unpopular at home, causing political upheaval and prompting calls for accountability. Israel remained in southern Lebanon until 2000, facing constant guerrilla attacks from emerging groups like Hezbollah. The war, intended to bring security, instead helped give rise to a new and more powerful adversary. It also deeply affected Lebanon, further destabilizing the country and intensifying sectarian divides. Amid an already brutal civil conflict, since 2008, a series of violent conflicts have erupted between Israel and Hamas, the Islamist militant group that governs the Gaza Strip. These operations began after years of rocket fire from Gaza into southern Israel and growing tensions following Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, the first major conflict. Operation Cast, led in 2008-2009, began after an escalation in rocket attacks. Israel launched a ground and air campaign targeting Hamas infrastructure, resulting in the deaths of over 1,000 Palestinians and widespread destruction in Gaza. International criticism focused on the civilian toll and the use of disproportionate force. In 2012, another conflict broke out known as Operation Pillar of Defense. It started after the targeted killing of Hamas military leader Ahmed Jabari. Over the course of 8 days, hundreds of rockets were launched from Gaza, and Israeli airstrikes responded with force, though shorter in duration. The operation highlighted the increasing reach of Hamas's rocket capabilities, some of which reached cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Operation Protective Edge, in 2014, was the deadliest and most prolonged of these wars. It lasted for 50 days and involved intense urban combat, airstrikes, and the discovery of underground tunnels Hamas had built to infiltrate Israeli territory. Over 2,000 Palestinians and more than 70 Israelis were killed. Much of Gaza's civilian infrastructure was destroyed, leading to humanitarian crises and long-term damage to daily life. In 2021, another intense conflict unfolded during Operation Guardian of the Walls, triggered by tensions in Jerusalem and violent clashes around the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The fighting lasted 11 days and involved over 4,000 rockets fired from Gaza and hundreds of Israeli airstrikes. Civilian areas on both sides suffered, but the impact on Gaza was especially severe. These recurring cycles of violence reflect the heated, unresolved political conflict between Israel and the Palestinian territories. The history of Israel's wars with its neighboring countries and the Palestinian territories is long, painful, and deeply complex. Each conflict, from the 1948 War of Independence to the ongoing struggles in Gaza, has left behind scars that stretch across generations. These wars were shaped by fear, survival, politics, and power, but also by missed opportunities for peace and understanding. What unites them all is the human cost. Families torn apart, homes destroyed, futures lost. As we reflect on this history, we must remember that behind every military strategy or territorial dispute are ordinary people, children, parents, and elders, who long simply to live in safety and dignity. Peace is not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice, compassion, and dialogue. And while history cannot be changed, how we learn from it can shape what comes next. Asterisk.